Well, good morning again. Whenever you're listening this, I am, or Steve and I are alternating back every other week. And at this point, it's been 2 weeks since I talked at that time about the authority of Christ. And when Jesus had thrown out the demons from this fellow, and they went into the pigs, and they ran down the hill and died. And at that time, I focused on the concept or the idea of Jesus' authority. We're expanding a little bit on that concept. We're talking about some other things, but obviously in review here, Jesus has authority over all things. He has authority over creation, in the sense that what we're going to talk about today, Jesus walked on water. He has authority over spiritual beings. The spiritual beings in the demon-possessed man recognized Jesus immediately. There was no need for introductions, and they recognized that he had power and authority over them, and they begged for mercy in that sense. So, in moving forward with Jesus' authority over things, we're going to talk a little bit today about his authority over creation, or over what we might call the laws of physics. Jesus walked on water. I have an interesting story. Walking on water isn't so unusual for us up here, depending on the season. We can drive on water in that sense. We had a fellow who was visiting us. He is married to Tammy's cousin. He lives in Nigeria, and he had never experienced anything like this. And his name was Ola. And when he was at our house, he wanted to walk on the lake. Of course, it was January. There was probably 2 feet of ice on the lake. He didn't have the appropriate winter clothes, and so I got him some warm boots and a warm coat and hat and mittens. And we walked down from our house onto the lake. And his first steps or two were very tentative, even though you could look out and you could see cars and pickup trucks and ice fishing houses all over the lake. He was extremely cautious because he had never walked on water before. And after we walked out, 30 or 40 yards onto the ice, he pulls out his phone and he calls his brother in London, and he was just so excited to tell him that he was walking on water. So I never forgot that story. I've always found it fascinating because walking on water in that sense is rather routine for us, and we take it for granted. But the story of Jesus walking on water did not occur here in the wintertime. It occurred on the Sea of Galilee, and there's a lot to go into the story before we get to that point. So let's open with a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we are so grateful for your word. We are grateful for a chance to have it available to us, and that we can divide and dissect it into various parts that we can begin to understand not only your intent for us, but how that we can apply your word in our lives. Guide and direct us as we study it. Give us insight, give us wisdom, give us courage to apply it in ways that would be glorifying to you. In your name, amen. So let's start by turning to Matthew chapter 14, verses 20 to 24. Beginning of verse 22, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So let's look at the context of this. In Matthew chapter 14, we read at the beginning of the chapter that Jesus was notified by John's disciples that John the Baptist had been beheaded, and that they had taken his body and buried him, and they came and delivered this news to Jesus. Following that, they were present in this area along the Sea of Galilee. There was a large crowd that had gathered, estimated to be approximately 5,000 men. And it was there that Jesus with the bits of food that Steve had talked about last week, the barley loaves and the fish that a boy had, Jesus had blessed this, and they fed the multitudes there. And when everyone had eaten whatever they wanted, had had their fill, he had the disciples go and pick up all the remains or the leftovers, and it filled 12 baskets full. It was a demonstration of his authority. It was a demonstration to the people and his disciples that he was who he claimed to be. Following that, Jesus immediately sent the disciples away, and he tried to retreat onto this mountainside where he could have some, I guess we could call it downtime. He wanted some peace and quiet. He needed to rest. He needed to be restored. But mainly it said that he went up on the mountain to pray. And I'm sure to meditate on whatever God was leading him in at that time. I think there's a lot that was happening at this time. He lost his John the Baptist, who was a forerunner to him, who was a relative of Jesus. And I'm sure this was a devastating blow to him, even though he knew it would happen. The loss of life, you can see it in other places. When Lazarus died and Mary and Martha were concerned and came to Jesus, and he wept with them. He felt their emotional loss and pain. And so the loss of John the Baptist, I'm sure, was no less painful or stressful, and reminded him as well of what his future destination would be with respect to his ministry on earth, of which he already knew. Twice in chapter 14 there, first after the death of John the Baptist and after feeding the crowd, Jesus tried to get away and be alone. Now, it's good to be alone sometimes. Not all the time, but, in stressful situations and difficulties, it is good to relax and pray or to be restored. There's healing power in meditation and prayer. This is not to say that gathering together, certainly in situations where you gather together and worship and pray, we're not to avoid gathering together, but there is a time that we need to also come apart from that and be alone and spend some time in meditation and prayer. And it's also good for those requesting some space to allow it. We need to be respectful of those who may desire to be alone, to rest, to recuperate, and sometimes it's hard for some of us to let someone go, if you will, away for a period of time, fearing that you may have offended them or that there may be something between you. And more than likely, someone just needs to be restored. And allowing that time to be restored, to recuperate, is certainly appropriate on all parts. So let's start with a question. During unusually stressful times, do you seek time alone to meditate, read, and pray, or do you try to tough it out by continuing your same routine no matter what happens? As a follow-up question, what advantages are there to being alone in difficult times, and what are the risks of being alone in difficult times? And during such times, how has being alone helped you? I'd encourage you to discuss these. Obviously, there's going to be a wide range of individual responses with this, but I think it's helpful to understand each other's response with respect to quiet times, if you will, and how can we facilitate one another to experience these in an optimal way. So go ahead and discuss these, and come back shortly. All right, so immediately after feeding of the 5,000, he sent them away and he retreated to pray. It was nighttime. It was windy. The boat had made it a good distance from shore, but they had been at it all night. I'm sure they were tired. It was near dawn when Jesus went to them. They had been rowing for probably 8 or 10 hours without getting to the other side. So this is a tumultuous situation, if you will, with the disciples going away. They had just been through the experience of feeding the 5,000, which was a high point, if you will, in the ministry of Jesus, and certainly in their experience of his ministry. So going from that into a difficult or a challenging situation would have been quite a contrast. Now, I looked up the Sea of Galilee, and it's about 13 miles long and about 8 miles wide. And it said they'd been rowing for hours, and which means they probably were halfway across, which would mean they were somewhere between 4 to 6 miles from shore. So it was still quite a distance when you think about it. So if you were 5 miles from shore in a windstorm during the night, seeing another boat approaching would have been near miraculous, but to see someone approaching by walking on the water would have certainly startled any of us. Jesus appeared and they were frightened. They thought it was a ghost. I can imagine that this would have been a terrifying event, at least initially. So if we look at this scene, there's 3 primary participants. Obviously, there was Jesus, who dismissed them to go across the lake, to leave him alone, then he retired to pray. There was the disciples as a group, and there was Peter as the standout individual in this group. Now, if you look at the disciples as a whole, many of them were hardworking, probably rough type characters. Many of them were fishermen. So working out of a boat during the night wouldn't necessarily be unusual. I have an interesting quote here. It said, "There are old fishermen and bold fishermen, but there aren't likely many old, bold fishermen." So what do I mean by that? These people would have likely been very pragmatic or practical. If they knew a storm was coming, they probably would have just waited it out on the shoreline before attempting to cross. Knowingly crossing a wide, expanse of water during the night during a storm would have been foolhardy. And there would have been a high likelihood of capsizing or drowning or some other catastrophic event. So we can assume, based on this, that they did not expect a storm before leaving the shore. Now, some of the things that I've read about the wind were about the changes in the weather in that area. These windstorms can be rather sudden in appearance, and so predictability, at least at that time, was probably not very good anyway. But anyway, if they had known a storm was coming, they probably wouldn't have gone. So we can assume then that they didn't expect a storm before they left. So let's look at Jesus in this situation. We can safely assume, because Jesus is God, that he knew the storm was going to arise. Sending them ahead had as much to do with his own need for quiet as it did for them to teach them or demonstrate his power and authority to the disciples. If the storm was blowing on the lake, it likely was blowing on the hillside as well, where Jesus went to pray. Now, he had been told about John the Baptist's death. He had fed the 5,000. Then he dismissed his disciples and went on the hill. He must have been overcome with physical and emotional exhaustion. If you could put yourself in that setting, having gone through the death of John the Baptist and all these events and all of these people clamoring for his attention, this would be, for me anyway, this would be difficult to handle throughout the day. And then when we read the time when Jesus shows up out on the lake, it was shortly before dawn. Now, from the shore out to where the boat was, it was probably 4 miles. So this is not just a short little jaunt along the shoreline. If they were halfway across the lake, in the shortest diameter, you're looking at 8 miles. So let's say he had a 4-mile walk on the water during the storm, heading out to where they were. And the third character that we're going to look at in this setting, of course, is Peter. Peter is the sort of the outlier here, the interesting character. And we know from reading in other places that Peter tends to be impulsive and probably brash. Later on, we read, when Jesus was washing his disciples' feet in the upper room, and suddenly Peter asked for more than just his feet. He wanted his head and his hands washed as well. Jesus predicted that Peter would deny him around the time of the trial, just prior to the crucifixion, and Peter challenged him, stating he would never do such a thing, and of course he did. So let's read on in the story a bit more here. Matthew 14, verses 25 to 31. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" Now, fear was probably the primary emotion in all of this. They were exhausted. They had gone through the whole events of the day before with Jesus. They were isolated at sea. It was nighttime. There was a storm. There was a risk of dying. Fatigue and darkness tends to amplify fear. Everything seems a little better in the morning, but when evening comes around and if there's some anxiety of something happening during the day, it just tends to amplify at night. Some of the translations described the experience of the disciples as terrifying, or this terrifying by any definition would be excessive fear. It wouldn't be unusual from a purely a physical standpoint or a psychological stress during these things to have hallucinations during a time like this, to see or experience things that weren't real. We know that Jesus was real. Obviously, this was not a hallucination that they had, but the incredible stress, the exhaustion, the fatigue, the threat of immediate peril in the storm, all of these things would have played a huge role on the disciples and their emotional stability. So during times like this, it would not be unusual to do irrational things. They see Jesus on the water during the storm, and they initially think what they see is a spirit or a ghost. But Jesus identified himself and told them not to be afraid. And it was Peter who called out. We don't know. I'm sure the other disciples were mumbling or yelling or saying whatever, but Peter's words at least are recorded. It said, "Lord, if it's you, let me come to you." So, we have a question here. If you've ever experienced prolonged lack of sleep, emotional exhaustion, and stress, how has this affected your way of thinking and the way you act? Now, I thought immediately of a parent of a young child who may be sick or dealing with toddler temper tantrums or things like this. I can recall those days easily enough. And after several sleepless nights, you feel emotional and exhausted and stressful. It affects your thinking and the way you may act out. A husband or wife says something and the other one yells back, and immediately everybody's edgy. So, in your experience in a situation like this, how has it affected your thinking and the way you acted? And as a follow-up question, was Peter's reaction an irrational response due to a culmination of fear, exhaustion, and sudden relief at Jesus' appearance, or was it a step of faith? This will challenge you to put yourself in the mind of Peter, if that is remotely possible. But it's an interesting way to look at it. Was what he was doing just an irrational response, or was it a step of faith? So here's some thoughts, just given the setting of everything that's going on. How do we extrapolate that into some of the things that we may experience in life here? One of the things that comes to mind, and I was recently praying for the Fink family with the loss of Shar, and it brought to mind some of my own experiences with loved ones suffering from cancer and eventually passing away. But after the death of a spouse, it's usually advised that the surviving spouse does not make any major decisions for at least a year, because the stress of the events leads to fatigue, exhaustion, incoherent thoughts, memory lapses, and sometimes odd or irrational behavior. Now, Peter and the disciples experienced some of these very same emotions compressed into a short time. Getting out of the boat in the middle of the night during a storm isn't a rational decision, but I think it happened to illustrate a point. Now, we can argue back and forth on this, but here's my question on this. Jesus allowed all this to happen to demonstrate his love and care for us and his presence with us during the most difficult times we could ever experience. So here's my question. Does this give us the green light to make risky, irrational decisions under the guise of stepping out in faith, with the assumption that God will keep us from harm or save us from the logical consequences of our actions? And is there a difference between stepping out in faith and illogical or irrational, risky behavior? I'm not trying to make an issue out of this. People that I'm amazed sometimes at the faith of people and doing things, and then sometimes I wonder if I could make some of those same decisions. You weigh the risks and the benefits all the time in making decisions. Should we do this or should we do that? And I'm not in the least way attempting to say that Peter didn't have faith, but it makes me think about situations where there are difficult decisions to be made. Is there a difference between stepping out in faith and illogical or irrational, risky behavior? I'm not trying to demean the process in any way, but sometimes it's good to wrestle with difficult ideas. So I would love to hear your responses on these. You'll have to tell them to me another time, but go ahead and discuss them. So Peter is often criticized because he took his eyes off Jesus and looked at the winds and the waves. But he was the only one who got out of the boat. The other ones, I'm sure, were clinging to the oars or the sides of the boat or the ropes or whatever there was to hang on to. And he was the one who asked to come to Jesus in the night, out there on the waves in the darkness. And when he began to sink, he didn't yell to his companions to throw him a rope. He called to Jesus to save him. He recognized the only source of his salvation, not only physically in this situation, but spiritually. So here's a question about Peter. Peter began to sink, and he cried out to Jesus to save him. Jesus immediately reached out and helped him, but he asked Peter, "Why did you doubt, you of little faith?" If he said Peter had little faith, what do you think he told the other disciples when he got into the boat and the wind stopped? Did he remind them of their total lack of faith? Or did he commend them for exercising their wisdom by not getting out of the boat in the middle of the lake at night? Okay, let's read onward. Matthew 14:32 through 36. And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all of the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. So I think the response of the disciples in the boat was immediate and appropriate. They worshiped Jesus. They identified him as the Son of God. I think if they had any doubts prior to that time, this likely erased it forever. I don't think Jesus said anything to the disciples that remained in the boat. His demonstration of authority and compassion during a very dangerous time would have been enough to humble any observer. And we know that they were humbled because they worshipped him and recognized him as the Son of God. So I really don't think that Jesus said anything to them. What was demonstrated with Peter was enough to quiet anyone's question of his authority at that time. So the story repeats. It was morning. They arrived on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. They landed in an area called Gennesaret. The people recognized Jesus. The people came to Jesus to be healed, and those who touched his clothing were healed. This whole scenario basically repeats the announcement of the death, feeding the crowds, the night alone, the long walk on the sea, the storm, the interaction with Peter, the disciples just before dawn, and now the crowds pressing again. The stress of our daily lives really seems petty compared to what Jesus experienced here on earth. It's easy to read these stories. It's easy to see the amazing events that happened, the miracles, the amazing insight, if you will, that some people had and some people didn't have. But when you read through these events, it's been condensed down and crystallized, and we've read it over and over and over. If we were to put ourselves into the lives of those people as it unfolded, I'm sure it was incredulous at times, exhausting, fatiguing, just ups and downs, all of the time with respect to challenges from authorities and, so many things happening. As I try to put myself into these settings, I have a greater and greater respect for what Jesus did, because this must have been just utterly exhausting to deal with these crowds pressing on him day after day, requesting help, and obviously they needed it. But so what can we learn from these series of events? Jesus very likely felt the effects of fatigue and emotional exhaustion. During that time, he made a clear effort to get away and rest, to meditate and pray, to be with God and allow God to refresh him in ways that activities or tasks can't necessarily accomplish. I think that's a clear recommendation for us to spend that quiet time whenever we can get it, to be refreshed, to meditate on truth, to meditate on God's goodness and grace and mercy and God's authority, and continually be in prayer during those times that we would be lifted up so that we could in turn be salt and light in the world. Jesus demonstrated his ability to overcome the laws of nature in order to reassure us of his continued presence and his ability to calm, the storms in our lives. Peter's moment of doubt when he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the problems around him demonstrates that Jesus is and should be the focus of our faith. He doesn't always stop the storm, but he is with us through it. He saved Peter from drowning, and he healed many by allowing them to touch his clothing, but his purpose here on earth wasn't necessarily to save us from physical harm, but to save us from spiritual death, which is the greater danger. If we aren't saved from spiritual death, then relief from physical pain and suffering is irrelevant. He saved and healed in a physical sense to demonstrate his power over life and death, and that faith in him is sufficient to save us from sin and spiritual death. There's a lot to think about in this story. Yes, he walked on the water, and that's amazing in and of itself. It's really, I'm sure if I was one of the disciples in the boat, I'm not sure that I would have believed my own eyes, except that Peter got out, he walked in the water, he started to sink, he was saved, and they got into the boat. It would be utterly amazing to think that Jesus had walked 4 miles out on the water during a storm and knew exactly where they were. But that's not the whole point of the story. The point is that he seeks us out to save us from destruction that we cannot save ourselves from. And he has demonstrated his willingness and his ability and his authority to do so time and time again. So, looking at his suffering, his emotional turmoil, his fatigue, brings to light his humanity. He was fully God, he was fully man, and knowing that he came and suffered in that way helps me to understand, or mainly just get through some of the things that we all struggle with, and realize that this is probably little more than an inconvenience, and that I need to continue to rely on God's leading and God's direction and God's teaching, and to seek quiet places to absorb it more fully without distractions. So I hope this was beneficial to you. I hope these questions were challenging in whatever way into your insight, into your lives. And I just pray that we can meet together again in the near future and be able to have personal interactions and discussions in a lively manner that would be glorifying to God. So let's close in prayer. Our God, we thank you again for the opportunity that we have to spread your word, even when we can't meet in a safe manner face to face. You have allowed us opportunities to spread your word in ways that we hadn't foreseen before. I pray that your word would be blessed as it goes forward, and that it would be received well. Continue to guide and direct us as a church, as a people of God, not only in the local communities, but throughout the world. I continue to pray for our country and all the countries affected by the situations at hand, and that you would remind us that you are in charge, and that you will bring us grace and patience to get through this in ways that would be pleasing to you. In Jesus' name, amen.